This is Carla Burgos with Louisiana Children, Louisiana CASA. I'd like to welcome you all to Teams Presents Educational Advocacy to CASA. I'd like to ask you if you're able to mute your phones. I hear a lot of background noise in the background, so it'll be helpful and courteous to others if we could make sure we monitor the muting on our phone. Um, as we go through the presentation, and the discussion, if you're familiar with how the web is going to work, you have options where you can raise your hand if you have a question. And keep in mind, we do have a question and answer at the back, but if you raise your hand, we can acknowledge that you do have a response there, and we'll be monitoring that as we go through the presentation. I'm going to go on into the presentation for the sake of time, and and someone still doesn't have their phone mute. So what I'm going to do is unmute everyone. I'm going to mute all. You'll be able to hear me. Again, I'm Carla Burgos, and you'll also be able to hear our presenter today, who's going to be Cassie Hubble. So let's get started on our presentation. Today on our educational advocacy agenda, we have the welcome. I'd like to welcome you to Louisiana CASA's presentation today on education advocacy. As CASAs, we know how important it is to have all of the components of the child well-being covered, and we hope that this educational advocacy training will prepare you to better advocate for children as they are in school, as it relates to their education, and so that they are able to thrive long term, even after their time in foster care is over or they've reached permanency. We hope that we have the type of advocacy that will carry on throughout their lives. I want to thank you all because together we are building a stronger Louisiana CASA network. I want to apologize for getting the notice out to you so late in the month, and then with us coming on board to do this so quickly. I think you got the notice on Monday, but I'm so happy to see the number of people who have registered and who are attending the training right now. And I want you always to keep in mind that we are building a strong Louisiana CASA network, and that the children in our state definitely need us. As we go through the agenda, I will be introducing the speaker, and the speaker will take over talking to you about what is Teams. And we'll go into Teams history, who leads the Teams mission, red flags, from the beginning, response to intervention, a sample letter, and then questions and answers will be answered in the last part. I want to talk to you today about how this is going to impact our children. I want you guys to really be mindful of what we're doing here and the role that we have as volunteer advocates in the process of helping these kids. Cassie Hubble is with Teams, and she has started this organization in 2007. I met her several years ago when I worked at the local CASA program in Shreveport, and she has been a great help to that area and other parishes in the northern part of the state. I think you'll find her information very useful. Cassie's very passionate about advocacy for children. I know she treats most of her kids like they're her own kids. And we know in true advocacy, the only way we can have an impact is that we have those same desires and wants for the children that we serve that we would have for our own children or family members that we love dearly. So I'm going to turn this over to Cassie, but I want to thank her also for pulling this together for us.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. I want to begin this by saying thank you for what you do for all the children, that we're working so desperately together to make sure that these children have an opportunity for a successful life ahead of them. As an advocate, I often think that sometimes it's kind of an unglorified job choice, but we're not in it for ourselves. We're in it for what we can make our children better for the future. So thank you all for being here. My name is Cassie. I am the director of Teams, which Teams stands for Training, Education, and Mediation for Students. Teams was started in 2007 by myself and another friend of mine, my business partner, Jill Goldsberry, when we realized that many of our children were ending up in the juvenile court system. Our numbers were already large in the northern Louisiana of Caddo Parish, But when we got involved, that we were finding out many of our students that were there were due to school-related charges. And then the school-related charges then filtered down to students that had exceptionalities or disabilities within the school system. Jill and I both having children with special needs, we didn't feel like this was a fair opportunity for a lot of our families. When you have a child with special needs, you're already in crisis mode all the time, just because of whether it's medical issues, cognitive, mental health, whatever the case may be, becomes very overwhelming. And then when you want to throw court-related issues in it, it becomes what we call a crisis mode. Not only are you dealing with everyday life issues, but now you're having to deal with the court system. And knowing how to navigate all of those roads become very overwhelming. So whether your child has special needs or a typical developing child, court is still scary. We always have a fear of losing our children in the process of whatever that process is, whether it's to the court system, to DCFS, to another family member, or whatever the case may be. So we thought this was very overwhelming for a lot of the families. So that's how TEAMS got its start. So in the meantime, TEAMS has branched out to other areas. Our focus then shifted back to what our passion is, and that's children that have physical and cognitive disabilities. I have a 23-year-old daughter right now who has cerebral palsy, what they classified as severe spastic quadriplegic cerebral palsy. So it made education very difficult for her because she can't walk, talk, or basically advocate for herself. At least she used to not be able to. So Jill also has a child that has multiple disabilities. So those are very clear disabilities that our children were faced. But then again, we started focusing on the children that were not very clear. So we're dealing with people who have mental health diagnosis or have been abused, physical, cognitive, or sexually abused. So it's the hidden scars that many of us don't see and acknowledge. So we work with students that are involved in the juvenile court system. We work with students that have special needs. And then our focus was what we call the crack kids, the kids that are sitting in the back of the classroom who are not big behavior issues, but they can't read and they can't participate, or they'd much rather be the class clown than the class dummy. So we sat there and we focused on all the students. So we branched out over the years. We started in Caddo Parish, and it was pulled into Bossier. And in the meantime, we now serve 7 parishes of North Louisiana. And what we have found is that the good thing is that what we do is mattering. We reduced the numbers in the juvenile court system. That was about 80% of our students that were involved there, to probably about 11% now from our best estimates at this time. So what we are doing is making a difference. What you are doing makes a difference. So what I'm here to do is try and help give you guys the tools that you need to better navigate the education system. It's not as cut and straightforward as we wish it was. But what we're here to do is work together to see how we can best support the child that's in front of us at the moment. So what I've kind of gotten together, I've put together is some information that I think is best for a lot of people who are working from what we call the beginning of the process of the education system. So what we're going to do is turn to the area for the red flags. So basically, we've kind of compiled a list of information of what we kind of call red flags. You know, a lot of times we deal with students who are, again, very clear issues that are going on, whether they have behavior issues, mental health, physical, cognitive issues. Those are very clear. So we treat those as red flags. And then we have the other students that we kind of handle as what I then call red banners. That flag is no longer small, it's huge. So just to kind of touch on some areas of some students that you may be working with, and I'm not going to go through all these. You guys have the handouts that are available to you, but I just kind of wanted to give you some to think about. One of the areas that we look at is if you have a student that's like in 6th grade and they're in 6th grade and they're struggling, but when you actually get into testing, you realize that they have a 3rd grade reading level. That seriously impacts how they perform academically. As we know, through Common Core and other stuff, that everything is linked to each other. So if you struggle in reading and comprehending or processing, that also makes doing the math work difficult. Word problems is always a problem for all of us, especially me. So when you're dealing with reading issues and then comprehension and processing, that all goes hand to hand. I have to say in Louisiana, that is probably one of our biggest areas of students who are not reading on grade level. Unfortunately, what we've seen in the time is that we have kind of taken this as, this is very common practice. It's the norm. So if you have an 8th grader who's reading on the 6th or 5th grade reading level, we kind of see that as accomplishment, which is very sad that our state has kind of accepted that as a standard. So that's one of the kids that we kind of look at. We also look at addressing students who have failed one or more times. Oftentimes what happens is that these students aren't recognized as becoming students that are struggling unless they're 2 to 3 years behind. By then, when you're dealing with the student who's about 3 years behind in a middle school, most oftentimes they don't fit in the desk anymore. They don't want to go to school anymore. They're not with their peer appropriate peers. They become discombative because they don't want to be there. They don't want to seem like they're not able to do the work. Again, this is very common. I have worked with students here that is 14 years old and in the 4th grade, 16 years old and in the 7th grade. That sends a signal to a lot of people. One of them being that if you have a student who is 16 and in the 6th grade, they don't fit in the desk. Many times I don't want a male of that age sitting next to a female of that age, because what they do is they adapt to their peers. And that can become some serious issues, because now we have possible relationships going on with that much age difference. And at that much age difference, they can actually be charged under the Children's Code as sexual assault. And we don't want these students having anything more additional on them. So we have to look at the age difference that's there. Again, we have to look at the factor of them being able to complete the work. Other things, like I've said before, is that we address students who are sitting in the back and they don't come up on teachers' radar because they're not a behavior issue, that they can't read and they can't do the work. But little Johnny is very quiet and cooperative. So he's not usually considered needing any supports in school because he never asks questions. Many times our students don't want to ask questions because they don't want to seem like they don't know the answers. We also deal with students a lot of times who can't pass the LEAP test. So many times they're left behind for at least 2 years. Again, that's putting them academically behind. So if they fail the LEAP test twice, or if they fail the 8th grade twice, we're now 4 years behind. And we wonder why Louisiana has the highest dropout rate. Don't get me wrong, we are in the process of changing all of those things and giving better opportunities for those who so they won't become so far behind in school. Other things that we want to look at are students who are suspended repeatedly, who have a high number of truancies, who have discipline issues. Again, there's usually a reason for every behavior in school. We want to address those issues, because if we can get the behaviors under control, not only does it benefit that one student and benefit the teacher so that they can continue teaching the other students in the classroom. There is a reason for every behavior. And unfortunately, sometimes we also have to be investigators to see how we can resolve that situation. Other things that we want to look at is when we have students that are being sent home repeatedly, but yet in their attendance sheet, it shows that they've been in school. We then deal with truancy issues. Are they being sent home without suspension paperwork, or are we dealing with truancy issues? That's kind of a twofold thing, and that's something that I urge all of you guys to pay close attention to, because when we are dealing with students who have significant behavior problems in the school system, then oftentimes parents are called to come pick them up, bring them back in a couple days. Sometimes we call those cool-off days, we call them weekend days, whatever the case may be. Families need to know that you do not pick up a student without suspension papers. There's a reason for that also, twofold. If that student goes home without suspension papers, we could possibly be looking at truancy in the future. They are missing academic days for their schoolwork and they've continued to get a little further behind. 3, if they are a special ed student, if those days are not counted, the parish is getting out and having to provide additional supports. Remember, key note, any student that is special education as an IEP student cannot be suspended for more than 10 days per school year. Yes, per school year. Please make a note of that. Many times parents are told that they can't come home or they're suspended for 9 days at a time. Okay, if you want to suspend them for 9 days, just know that any time after that 10th day, the parish is responsible for compensatory ed services. So those are just some areas that we kind of consider as red flags. So if we are dealing with a student that has not been identified as being a student with an exceptionality, then we need to start the process. Keep in mind, just because a student may have a diagnosis doesn't mean that they automatically qualify for special ed services or 504 services. What the law states is that disability or behavior has to seriously impact their academic performance. So if little Johnny is diagnosed with ADHD, but yet has very good grades or medium grades, then it is not seriously impacting their academic performance. Don't get diagnoses confused with exceptionalities. Those are two very different languages. So I'm going to pause right now just to see if it's okay if we want to ask any questions before I go any further. Does anybody have any questions?
If you have any questions, can you raise your hand and then we can unmute you so that you can answer that question. And you should have something on your screen that looks like a hand icon, and you just click on it if you have a question. And I'm monitoring to see if anyone has a question. Okay, Landa Lawrence has a question. Okay.
That's right. Hi there, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Great. So the very last thing you were talking about when interventions are started, can you restate what you said about what the diagnosis doesn't guarantee versus whether whatever's going on is impacting their school performance?
Okay, so basically what we're looking at is oftentimes we have children who may have a medical diagnosis. Let's say oppositional defiant disorder or asthma or some of those other issues. If those issues are not seriously impacting their academic performance, they may not be considered as needing any accommodations or special services.
Perfect.
Is that clear?
Yes, that helps. Thank you.
Okay. Does anybody have any other questions?
Okay, I'm monitoring now to see if there are any other questions. And I want you all to be mindful that you can click on the handouts and you can actually download your handout and view your handout as Cassie discussed that information. We don't have any more questions.
Okay, so I'm going to kind of toggle between these next two handouts, and the next two handouts is from the beginning and the RTI. What is the RTI process or response intervention? So because these two almost go hand in hand, I will probably talk about both of them almost simultaneous. If you guys have any questions or need clarifying, raise your hands and Carla will stop me and I will be glad to answer the questions at that time. Because sometimes I may not follow up on that question that you're needing an answer to. So if you are having a child that is affected academically, then you have to begin the process with an SBLC meeting. An SBLC stands for School Building Level Committee. And that process, that request starts the process of whatever your concerns are. The concerns may be addressing behavior issues, academic issues, and or medical related issues. So sometimes having an SBLC is basically a follow-up or an understanding for the school to know what is going on, because that child's education may be affected. An SBLC meeting can be started by 3 different ways: parent initiated or guardian initiated, teacher initiated, or school. A parent initiated is basically those concerns, or a guardian is initiating an SBLC meeting. Typically, it's because their child is struggling academically, or there is a medical diagnosis that the school wants them to be aware of. Let's say if a child is released from a mental health hospital for assessment, or if they've completed an evaluation and they've been diagnosed with something, they want the school to know that. That is the best way to start that, because that puts that information on record. So many times we may have a student, in fact, I work with one here, a child is gifted and talented in the magnet program that has mental health issues. She's in a magnet program, so you can't really say her academics are seriously impacted. But at times they can be. If she has a meltdown or is dealing with other issues, she may miss some school. So basically, it's on the record that if she misses school, it's typically due to this mental health diagnosis. Okay? So she's not getting really accommodations. They're getting understanding and acknowledgement from the school. So again, going back to parent or guardian initiated, it's medical information or academic performance. A teacher can initiate an SBLC meeting. If a teacher initiates an SBLC meeting, it is typically done because they see that child is struggling in school and that they have concerns. So a teacher can initiate an SBLC meeting. The next step would be a school can request an SBLC meeting, and that is typical to address grades, behaviors, progression, and or possible retention. So if you have a student that, and I know many of you probably have heard that the school has said that they need to be held back another year because they either missed too many days or had poor grades in this area, that is a school-initiated SBLC meeting. Okay? So typically when you go to an SBLC meeting, you need to be prepared when you're walking in. The guardian needs to be prepared with what they're going in for. Have an outline of what your concerns are. Have notes, have questions prepared, and talk to typically the parties that are involved in an SBLC meeting is a regular ed teacher, a special ed teacher, a counselor of some type, sometimes the principal or the assistant principal. If it is just you and a teacher or teachers, at that point it's just a parent-teacher meeting. You will receive, okay, so let's back up. If you are requesting an SBLC meeting or a meeting of any kind, please remember everything is done in writing. If it's not done in writing, it didn't happen. It is very common for parents or guardians to think that they have a good rapport with the school and can ask Ms. Johnson, hey, we need to have an SBLC meeting, and kind of follow it up with, and she forgets. She's a teacher and she's busy, she forgets, or you spoke to the counselor. If it wasn't in writing, it didn't happen. What also happens whenever you put anything in writing, they have 10 days to respond to your request. Respond to the request. That doesn't mean that a meeting is going to happen in 10 days, but they have to at least respond to it. So at the SBLC meeting, that is when you want to go ahead and present any information for the concerns that you have. So let's say if we're dealing with behavior issues in school or academic issues. Now here's where we come into play, which is RTI, response to intervention. Response to intervention is basically was set up probably about 20 years ago, and Louisiana was probably one of the last states to fall into the requirements from the federal government. What response to intervention was created for is that we were over-identifying students that had learning disabilities and putting them in the category of special education services. So what this does is, A, it stops the over-identification into special education. 2, it helps the school understand what is going on, as far as they have to sit back and take so many weeks to collect the data to see how that student can best be served. During that process, RTI kind of looks like if little Johnny needs one-on-one reading, or if he needs to have quiet time when he's reading, or different resources available to him. So you're basically kind of determining, what is the concern? Is it a math concern? Is it a reading concern? Is it processing? What all's involved, instead of just turn around going, oh yes, this child qualifies for, let's say, multiple disabilities under an IEP, or specific learning disability under an IEP. So in the handout that I provided, it kind of gives an outline of why an RTI is done. And I kind of went over some of that information with you. And then the next section that we'll come to on the second page is there is a 3-tier model as far as RTI. So RTI is also used for behavior. And the behavior, RTI is part of the behavior process and the learning process, because remember, behaviors affect their academic performance as well. So most schools follow a 3-tier model as far as response to intervention. And in this 3-tier model, it will outline that there's screening and grouping in Tier 1, and it kind of outlines the students who are at risk. And what happens in that first tier is they kind of do an assessment of what's going on with the classroom and how everybody's performing. So I'm going to give you an example. If we have a student that is reading poorly in the 3rd grade, and they screen that whole classroom, and that whole classroom is reading about on that same level, then that student is performing with their peers. Again, that kind of goes back with the statement that I'd said earlier, that sometimes Louisiana has this kind of taken that as a consideration, that this is the area that all their peers are learning. So if we have peers that are in 3rd grade and they're all reading on 1st grade, almost 2nd grade, then they're online with all their peers. So keep in mind that that's not acceptable. Push to know more. So that's the first part of the tier process, the RTI. Then after you've kind of gone through to the second part, that is targeted interventions. What can we do to improve this student's reading ability? And I'm focused on reading just because it's one of the biggest issues that we have. So then that student can receive, some schools do 45 minutes of additional reading 5 days a week. Some schools may do 30 minutes once a week. So it can vary based on what type of RTI is provided in that school. So after they've gone through so many weeks of data collecting in both of those areas, then if the student still shows that they're needing supports, is when you go on to Tier 3. And that's an intensive intervention. So that's when they start looking at to determine if this child would benefit from having special education services. So if usually by the time you're to the 2nd tier, you're going to know whether or not if this child needs to go to the 3rd tier. Keep in mind, what the law also states, and this is I'm going to put out there, that if the child is in any of the tier processes of the RTI, typically most schools will say that it takes them 27 weeks to collect all of the data through the RTI process. That is a long time. You're looking at more than about half the school year to determine if a child needs supports. that is entirely too long. As a rule of thumb, what I typically do when I'm working with the child that's in the RTI process is that I meet back every 3 weeks to determine if these supports are working. If I get to probably about the third round of the 3 weeks, so we're looking about 9 weeks roughly, then I will request for that student to be moved to the third tier. Also, during that time, you can request for a child to receive a special education evaluation if you have supportive documentation. So that is kind of some of the RTI process. Below we have questions for RTI, things that you need to kind of have prepared, keep in mind, ask the questions. So this is kind of just a checklist that some of you guys can use or the parents can use when they're in the meetings. So I'm going to stop for a moment just to see if we have any questions on RTI.
If you have any questions, please remember that you can raise your hand on that hand icon if you click on that. Okay. Landa, do you have another question? Let's see.
I could ask, are you working with the Caddo Parish Schools and the Bossier Parish Schools with the RTI programs? And how many of those programs are still going on this school year? And I'm asking because I was an RTI person in one of the elementary schools, and that position was cut because of funding this year. So I wanted to know if that was a district-wide thing from Caddo and Bossier, or just a school the program was cut.
That position may have been discontinued, and I'm not quite sure. But RTI is an integration for all services. So now, for any student to be considered for special ed assessment or evaluation, they have to go through so many weeks of RTI. That is the federal guideline. Because to reduce the number of over-identification, and if a student is considered SLD, specific learning disability, they have to be able to outline in there in what areas that they have that specific learning disability with so many data points.
So they can't take the program away entirely because
no, they still have teachers that still provide RTI on a daily basis. Now, I know they used to have coordinators, RTI coordinators, and that may be what you and I are kind of talking about, but they still have to do so much data points.
Okay, great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we have Dennis. Dennis, you have a question?
Yes, I'm a CASA advocate, and I've had an issue with one of my cases in that with a little boy that she has, the foster mother has. There's kind of a conflict on who the parish school board is accepting as the parent. One, the caseworker, the DCFS caseworker, tried to initiate testing in or an SBLC, and they were told no, the foster mother was. And then the foster mother tried to get it started, and basically they got slowed down, and there was no action taken. So in the case of a foster parent, a foster child, who plays the parent, the state or the foster mother?
Well, and that's kind of a dual answer to your dual question. So basically what happens is that DCFS has custody of that child. So they are in essence the guardian. They are the ones who are supposed to initiate the request for assessments, evaluations, meetings, whatever the case is. But it's also very important that the foster parent play a role in that assessment, because they know the child. They're the ones who are taking care of the child. Now, also what can happen is that if DCFS wants to turn over what we call surrogate parent. So surrogate parent takes the role of a party who cannot be present for meetings. DSFS is very overwhelmed and a lot of times cannot be at all the meetings. But I can't say if they've ever given the okay to allow that foster parent to be the surrogate parent of a meeting. So yes, it kind of gets to be confusing, but as far as what the law states that only the guardian can initiate a meeting request or an assessment or evaluation.
Well, see, that's what was strange, is that they would not let DCFS initiate it. The person at the school board office or at the school said, no, we're not going to do this until we hear from Miss so-and-so, the foster mother. So I take it the school board was messing up then. The school and the school board were messing up.
Yes, because what the law states is that the person that has guardianship should initiate or has to initiate.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I will get back with that foster.
I'm not going to say that you're not going to get a little pushback still, but that's what the law states.
Okay. Well, now that I know that, I can talk to the foster mother and I can talk with the child's lawyer as well and say, you may need to intervene here, and I'll talk.
And and I know that CASA advocates are advocates, but
right.
Every part of Louisiana has special education advocates available to it. Teams is only in Northwest Louisiana, but there are other agencies that can assist with supports if the child is special education that has a intellectual disability. Unfortunately, what happens is a child may be special education but not have an intellectual disability, and then that other agency cannot provide support.
Okay, yeah.
When in doubt, I'm always available.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Uh-huh.
Okay, Shanita has a question. I hope it's Shanita or Shanita. And Leslie, you'll be up next. Shanita, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, just to sort of add on to what the gentleman was saying, I'm also a parent of a child with special needs and have served in a role as a special education advocate statewide. That really gets to be a tricky question in regards to DCFS actually being a parent, because of the difference between either the child is a ward of the state, or if the child has been placed in a foster care setting, then yes, the foster care parent would serve as the parent. But if the child isn't placed in a foster care setting, then the child is considered a ward of the state. And the reason why I'm saying is because it gets to be very tricky, and I'm on the southeastern portion of the state. So that is something that myself, along with some other attorneys with the Child Advocacy Center, had presented on at the Together We Can conference. So I just wanted to share that with you.
Right, and yes, you're right. Unfortunately, what happens, sometimes you have parishes that have very good, clear stipulation and guidelines that outline who does what, but not all parishes do. And so you kind of have to determine what parish you're in and what their guidelines are and how that functions as well. Okay, any other questions?
Okay, we have Leslie up next. Leslie, are you with us?
Can you hear me?
Leslie?
Yes.
Okay. So
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Hi, I'm Leslie Adams. I'm the training coordinator, and I am grateful to also have Shanita as one of my CASAs. But I was going to reiterate that my understanding, and having attended several educational advocacy trainings recently, at least down here, is that DCFS normally cannot request the SBLC meeting. That's what I have been led to understand. So and that may be what Shanita was talking about, in that there's some question about whether or not they're the ward of the state. But my question was more about these the RTI process. Does that also hold true in the charter schools like we have down here in Orleans? Do they use the same process?
Well, that all depends on if the charter school is, how do I put this? Some charter schools don't provide special education services 504 accommodations. Some
Right.
do. If they are receiving federal funding, then yes,
Mhm.
they have to still
Okay.
adhere to the same guidelines as any of the public schools. What I've encountered here in the northern area is that many of the charter schools do not have the resources to effectively provide those supports. So they'll reach out to like some of the other public schools here for some of those supports, like assessments or providing related type services.
Sure.
So
Okay.
it all kind of depends on your funding resource that that charter school is getting and the supports that they have available.
Okay. Okay. Good to know.
Okay.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Okay, I think that's all of our questions, Cassie. Are you ready to move to the next portion, or?
Yes.
Okay.
So keep in mind, whenever you're dealing with we're going to kind of go back to SBLC meetings, that an SBLC meeting can be held for many different things, like I outlined. So you can still even have an SBLC meeting if your child is under special education. They may be calling the meeting for other issues such as academic performance still or attendance. So to kind of summarize it, so let's say we're calling an SBLC meeting because we have concerns for academic performance. We've gone through the RTI process. We've completed the evaluation. Then we're going to kind of go into having IEP meetings. So you have an initial IEP that basically gets support set up. And then you'll have an annual IEP every year to address the ongoing supports and needs that that student will remain having. Keep in mind, what you guys need to remember is that an IEP meeting can be called anytime there is a concern. It can be called more than one time a year. It can be guardian initiated or school initiated. So if there's any information that changes that you feel like the school needs to know about, like if they've received a new diagnosis, you can call for a meeting to address that within the IEP, or if you want the exceptionality to be changed and you want that taken into consideration. That's a lot of information just in itself. So if we're just kind of addressing the IEP itself, on average, what I tell families every year is that you want to make sure that you're having a transition meeting at the end of every school year, especially when your children are going from one school setting to the other, elementary to middle, middle school to high school. After they've made that transition, give it about 3 weeks after school starts back up the following year, and request another IEP meeting, just so that all the teachers can be aware of what their concerns are and make sure that they've received the supports that they need for that child to be successful that year. Make sure that families can attend anytime there's a meeting. Yes, an IEP meeting, SBLC meeting can be held if the parent is not there. The school is required to give 3 notices for a meeting. Typically, all 3 of them should be done in writing. And a parent has the opportunity to either say, yes, this day is good for me, or no, it's not, and ask for it to be rescheduled. Parents usually don't know that they have that opportunity, and if a date is not available for them to be able to be there, ask the school to reschedule it, because it goes based on if the parent can be there, because they're such a crucial part. And don't just take, this is what you have to do as the only option. I always encourage people that whenever you go into a meeting, take somebody with you. It's a lot easier and more comfortable to feel like you're not there by yourself. It's very intimidating to walk into a meeting of 15 professionals and just you as the parent, and trying to listen to everything that's being said. Oftentimes we walk into a meeting and it's very overwhelming to hear all the negative things that our children aren't doing or accomplishing, or they're behind. So it's always best to have somebody go with you, A, as support, B, as somebody else who can kind of hear both ends of the conversation of the table and to help keep notes. take an advocate whenever available, a friend, a family. Just try not to go by yourself. If a meeting is not going in the direction you want it to, you can stop the meeting, ask for it to be reconvened when a better time is for you, whether it's an emotional time or if you need somebody else to attend with you. They can become heated, especially when you're talking about your child, and I'm speaking as, not just foster parents, but I'm also speaking as parents themselves. If you're not happy with services, ask to be clarified. So let's say if they're getting physical therapy 3 days a week and all of a sudden they want to go to once a week, ask why, clarify the reason. If you're not happy with it, give another option on the table to see how everybody can best work together. Those are probably some of the best strategies. Go in prepared with questions, and usually you know what you're walking into as far as if you're going for behaviors or academics. On 504 services, 504 services are for students who need accommodations to the classroom setting and do not operate the same way as an IEP does. On the RTI page, I believe it's that page, there is a comparison chart for IDEA, which is special ed services, and 504 services. So that might kind of help better people put things together side by side so they can have an understanding as far as what the difference between the two are. On the last page, I've also provided a short list of acronyms. The book that I usually provide the families has about 3 pages of acronyms, but these are the ones that are most often used in meetings. Another resource that we tell families and professionals about is the rights law, and I'm not sure how many of you, probably many of you have heard of the rights law. They have a great website, a great book as far as understanding IEPs and 504 type services. Very easy to read, very reader friendly. If you ever have an opportunity to go to one of their trainings, I highly suggest it. So that is just kind of a crash course on IEPs, 504s, SBLCs, that type of information. In the packet, I've also included a sample letter. This is just a very generic sample letter that you can give to families if they need a starting process of how to request meetings. Is there any questions at this point?
Okay, let me monitor for the questions here.
If you guys have just kind of you kind of know the scenario and you want to answer to it, I'm open to try and help and give you direction in specific areas. If anybody has any questions.
I'm checking for the questions now. It looks like we do not have any questions thus far.
Okay.
Landa, hold on. It looks like Landa has another question. Hold on just one moment.
Hi there.
Landa, okay.
Okay, two questions. First should be an easy answer, but I'm assuming a CASA could be involved in any of these meetings, the SBLC meeting or any of the IEP or 504, any school meetings. Is that correct?
If you are invited by the guardian to participate, you can be in any of the meetings.
Okay. All right. And then just the next thing I wanted to know, if you could explain a little bit more if the issues that are brought up for help, have more to do with behavior than learning. My CASA child that I had a lot of behavioral problems, and of course it was affecting her education. But I think that the guardian was told different things about how she wouldn't qualify for services because she wasn't special ed, and things just kind of went round and round a lot during the school year because of her behavior, and many suspensions, and then during the summer she went from elementary school to middle school. So it was kind of a mess as far as her education went the whole year, but it did mainly have to do with behavior. So I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit more about maybe how I could advise when that's the primary concern.
Okay, so when you're in an SBLC meeting, school meeting, wherever you're at, if you're dealing with a child who has significant suspensions and behaviors, at that point would be a good time to request for the school to start conducting FBAs. That is a functional behavior assessment. And what that does is they complete documentation to determine what triggered the behavior, what took place during the behavior, and what was done after the behavior. So it's kind of a before, during, and after. What did they do to either reduce the behavior, de-escalate the behavior, what worked, what didn't work, especially when we're in elementary, middle school. That is a little easier to kind of determine what's going on just because you don't have a whole lot of outside going on as far as like a more high school drama, so to say, sometimes. But you need to ask the school, or somebody needs to ask the school for FBAs to be conducted. Usually a good FBA is completed within about 3 weeks of school, as long as the child is there. We need the child to be there to get good attendance and a good data tracking to determine what are the FBAs. So FBAs are handed to the teachers for them to fill out and complete to determine what the outburst was or the behavior within that teacher's classroom. Then everybody comes together to determine what the hypothesis was and what supports are needed.
Okay, that helps some. I'm assuming probably some of that was being done, but the behaviors were so severe in elementary school that it just caused so much disruption. The child spent, I would say, a total of probably 1/4 of the school year out of school in suspensions and such because of different behavior things.
And that's what I would want to start FBAs, and that's what I've done in the past. And
Okay.
again, knowing the language and knowing how to use the language in the meeting is going to be your best asset, because
Yes.
when you can speak their language, they're going to understand that you understand the child's rights.
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have any other questions? You can hit the raise your hand or question button, click on that, and we can answer any questions that you may have. I'm checking now. Well, Cassie, it looks like we don't have any other questions from the participants who are online. I do have a question that I'm interested in knowing. We kind of touched on the IEP, and we also talked about the 504. Can you just tell me, like, really quickly, some differences between those two that we can recognize, like, right away?
The best way to understand it is an IEP is an individual education plan for students that qualify for services under an exceptionality through 1508. So they've been identified in the school system as having an exceptionality. Remember, like I told you in the earlier part of it, just because they have a medical diagnosis, that doesn't mean that they will qualify for an exceptionality. And many times I have people come to me because their child has been diagnosed of having Asperger's or autism. So they have a medical diagnosis, so we think automatically that they qualify for special education services. Well, sometimes if a child has a diagnosis, again, that doesn't mean that they're affected in their academics.
So basically, what you're saying is that they would have to be affected in their academics is one of the signs or indicators.
Right.
But so for 504, we may be looking at a child. This is an individual assessment. They could land either way. So that's
Right.
why it's important that we ensure that we have the intervention.
Right. Well, see, if you have a child that has 504 services, 504 services are accommodations under the rights of the Civil Rights Act. So that's, you have civil rights, which is 504, and you have IEP, which is federal regulations for IDEA. So the best way I can explain it is, let's say if you work for a company and you're required to stand 10 hours a day and you physically can't stand 10 hours a day, you have to sit down every hour. That's an accommodation to your work environment. The same accommodations are given to you in your school environment. So
Okay.
if you need like certain accommodations as far as preferential seating, some tests read to you, it's kind of very minor things, accommodations to the classroom.
Okay, I got you. So that was one thing that I had noted in particular that I wanted to understand the differences. Now, Cassie, you've promised that you will come back for part two for the educational advocacy, so you can pass on some more information as it relates to educational advocacy.
I will be glad to.
In that session two, we're going to go more in depth into the IEP process. Am I correct?
We can, yes.
And planning and the rules and everything that goes along with that. So we have about 30 minutes to spare, but we don't have to use those 30 minutes. But I want to make sure that if there are any questions, that if anyone has any questions, that you have an opportunity to ask those questions and receive the answer before we disconnect the call. So you can either raise your hand or hit the question mark.
And I do want to bring this up just because.
I'm sorry, Viola has a question. So once Cassie finishes, Viola, you'll be on.
Okay. I want to bring this up just because I've been encountering this a little bit more in the past couple of years than I have in the past. Some schools are qualifying students under a 504 and an IEP. There is nothing in federal regs that says that you should do that or can do that. Just because of the same accommodations that you would receive under a 504, students can also receive under an IEP, but not vice versa. So if you have a student that qualifies for an IEP, they should not have a 504 also.
Okie dokie.
So that's just, it's only because I've been seeing it happening a little bit more. So just be mindful of that, because you want your child protected under an IEP because you have more security that way than you do under a 504 supports.
Thanks for sharing that tidbit with us. Viola, are you there?
Yes, but my question was answered in the discussion, so I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now, Dennis has a question, so I'm going to, Dennis, you're able to speak now. Dennis, are you there? I don't know how he came twice. I don't think, okay, here's another question. Melanie, so Melanie, are you there? Melanie? What's going on? Did we cut off?
She's in the chat box. She just wants to know if the webinar will be available for volunteers.
Oh, I do want to say, I know that we're having this conference throughout the state. If there's any questions that maybe weren't asked during the session, or if you think about it later, you're also welcome to email me with any questions, whether you're in my area or not. If I can't help you in whatever part of Louisiana you're in, I will do my best to give you direction in that area. Again, my email address is Cassie, CASSIE @teamsla.com or org.
Okay. And I will also add Cassie's information, contact information to the information I will be sending out to the program, so that people who weren't able to attend this webinar can also gather this information. So your program director or advocate supervisor will get that information to you. And also, you will have a follow-up evaluation for this training. So if you would complete those, it would be appreciated. Cassie, I want to thank you again, considering everything that's going on in the state with the rain and the hurricanes and all the disaster that's before us right now. I really appreciate you taking time away from your work and your family to do this for us. And so if there's anything we can ever do, please let us know. And we're going to sign off. And I hope to hear from you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you.